What is the United Front? It's basically a way in which the party tries to control and mobilize the people that are outside of it. So it's fundamental to domestic governance. It's fundamental to trying to mobilize resources abroad.
So what does that actually look like? And how far does it reach? In this episode, I sit down with Peter Mattis, president of the Jamestown Foundation, to unpack their new report, Harnessing the People. We trace how CCP United Front networks operate across the US and other Western countries.
There's a focus on influencing governments in the United States and Canada. The number that we have on file right now is over 1,000 in the United States. There is one person in that organization who is knowingly collaborating with the CCP. They're essentially hijacking our citizens' voices to represent the party.
So how are these groups able to grow, and in some cases, operate entirely without scrutiny? Mattis points to Canada as a revealing example.
A lot of these organizations were able to develop, were able to build, and they didn't really have to worry about being investigated, in part because the law enforcement intelligence resources in Canada are relatively small to be going after this.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Peter Mattis, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So Jamestown Foundation has recently introduced this report, frankly groundbreaking report, Harnessing the People, on the Chinese Communist Party's United Front work. And you identified over 2,000 organizations across a number of Western countries, right? The US, Canada. I've been thinking about Canada in particular because there seems to be a concentration of them there. Explain to me what the United Front is and how it works and how you can have such an astonishing number of organizations working on the behalf of the Chinese Communist Party in free countries.
Well, first, let's get something straight. Yes, it was Jamestown that published it, but it was our China Studies fellow Cheryl Yu who really did all of the work and the labor of getting all of that research together. And the fact is, she continues doing that kind of research. She's continuing to cover other countries. So there's more of this kind of thing to be discussed and thought about. But what is the United Front? It's basically a way in which the party tries to control and mobilize the people that are outside of it. So it's fundamental to domestic governance. It's fundamental to trying to mobilize resources abroad. And if you think about how the CCP is modernized, particularly since Deng Xiaoping kind of switched the relative openness to the outside world, it was a lot of technology, a lot of capital, the legitimacy that was offered by sort of being full members of United Nations organizations, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is, how do you identify your friends, mobilize them, and you use them to isolate neutrals or recruit them to your side or to strike at your adversaries and to keep them away from you? And fundamentally, we should think of this as kind of like political campaign machinery, right? It's not there because it's supposed to do exactly this thing. It's there because it's a tool that can be used for technology transfer. It's a tool that can be used to talent spot, whether you're looking for political talent, whether you're looking for scientific talent to bring back to the PRC, or, if you're trying to sort of mobilize people to show up for a leaders parade when they visit San Francisco or Seattle or any of a number of cities around the world where we've seen this kind of activity.
What you're describing, it sounds like this is something like that a Chinese consulate or embassy would be involved in. And explain to me how these institutions actually work. And are they, I suppose they have different levels of infiltration? Are they all just like founded to do this in the first place? How does that work?
Well, let's keep a couple of things in mind about this, right? United Front work is not like a covert action initiated in the United States that requires a presidential finding with the sense that this is what our national security is. Here we want to do these things. We want to apply these tools to get this result. United Front work is what the party does on a day-to-day basis. In fact, it's been described as the work of the entire party. And it's because there's a Politburo Standing Committee member who sits atop the system. There are a couple of Politburo members and a vice premier that deal with this system. And every single ministry in it has some role to play in it. There's a Ministry of State Security role. There's a Ministry of Foreign Affairs role. There's a Ministry of Commerce role, a Ministry of Education role. in addition to all of this party activity that runs from the central committee to provincial committees to local levels and anywhere else that you can find a party committee, right? So that means companies. Sometimes means joint ventures with foreign companies, right? So it means places like the Chinese Academy of Sciences or the Chinese Academy of Engineering, right? So it is actually a party system that's kind of wrapped all the way through. And so when you go over to a consulate, right, somebody there is going to have United Front work as their portfolio. But it's also not unheard of for the person who supposedly is doing United Front work to be a Ministry of State Security person, right? Because there is an intimate relationship, if you will, between intelligence collection and this kind of mobilization and talent spotting.
This sounds complicated somehow, because I know there's a United Front work department, right, which guides a lot of this work somehow, right? And at the same time, you're saying this institution exists literally throughout the whole system.
Right. So basically every party committee, maybe not every party committee, but a lot of them, will have a United Front work department, right? So you could find a United Front work department in a Chinese university. You can find a United Front work department in the China Academy of Social Sciences. At the same time, you have the central level, that's usually what people mean when they say, oh, there's the UFWD, right? But Beijing City has one. The Shanghai City Party Committee has one, right? And you could go down into basically every major, it's like prefectural level city, most counties, they're going to have a United Front work department, right? This is the important thing to think about. This is the connective tissue between the party and society. It's doing the organizational work to sort of move society in the way that it wants.
And that's, you've been talking about how it works, within China, but a big part of its work, of course, is outside.
Well, the big part of the work that really matters to us happens outside, right? But it is in part because this is a system that involves hundreds of thousands of people, right? And this work that happens outside follows some of the same issues, right? They want to organize, say, scientists and engineers to find, who are people that would be susceptible to recruitment, right? So you can find examples of individuals who have set up, say, a Chinese American Science and Technology Association, right, in their local area. They gather a handful of ethnically Chinese people around, maybe Taiwanese Americans if they can get them, and then that becomes a way to which that somebody gets approached by the PRC through one of the 590 odd talent programs in addition to the 1,000 talents, right? And in some cases you see them actively looking to American organizations where they can find a partner, or they've recruited someone as an overseas advisor to the Chinese Overseas Friendship Association, or as an overseas delegate to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or any of these other United Front organizations, and use that to facilitate the contact and to say, okay, oh, this is someone who could be useful.
So let's talk about the scale of the impact here. And then I also want to specifically talk a bit about Canada, because it seems to be there seems to be an unusual concentration there. But can you give me a picture of what this means? I can't remember the exact number in the U.S., but the implication of that. Yeah.
Suffice to say, I believe at least the number that we have on file right now is over 1,000 in the United States. And what we mean by those organizations is that there is one person in that organization who is knowingly collaborating with the CCP. Now, could they be doing it for their own profit? Could they be doing it because they do business in China and they want things left off their back, be left alone, right? But there's somebody who knows. And this gets to the first point, right? In a democratic society, right, we also use social groups to represent. So whether you're a town council member, whether you're a congressman, whether you're a senator or a governor, what have you, right? When you go and meet your constituents, you can't meet all of them all the time, right? You have to go to a club. You have to go to the Rotarians. You have to go to the Kiwanis Club. You have to go to PTA meetings. You have to go to church gatherings, right? And these, in many cases, are community organizations. So you show up, they organize their members. Or you select the leaders of these organizations because they represent 500 voters or 1,000 voters or what have you, right? But the problem here is that if the person who is a leader of this organization, who's sitting at that table, who's sitting face to face like this, is one of those knowing people, they're essentially hijacking our citizens' voices to represent the party. It's saying, instead of you and I thinking that we're having a real conversation and that I'm representing, 500 people in my community organization, I'm really representing Beijing's voice, but you think it's the 500 people behind me. Mm-hmm. Right? So that to me is fundamental, because it's actually, given that we're in a room that has scenes from Philadelphia, mention of the US Constitution, right? This is fundamental to what it means to have sovereignty embedded in the people, right? And they're taking voices away. At the worst case, you have things facilitating espionage, you have it facilitating technology theft, you have it facilitating transnational repression, right? That's surveilling people, keeping track of them, doing research on people. And this means that I think these groups often can end up being kind of like, it's like tall grass that's being deliberately cultivated to hide snakes, right? And the reason why I use this analogy is that for those 500 people, right, they're being used, right? It's not the grass's fault that snakes are hiding in it and making it dangerous, right? But they've been deliberately cultivated, they've been deliberately grown so that they can hide the Ministry of State Security, so they can hide the PLA, so they can hide the Ministry of Public Security, right? And this is where you end up with, these overseas police stations. This is where you end up with mobilization of community groups to affect elections, like happened in Richmond and British Columbia, right? Mm-hmm. This is where it is. But, the criminal stuff, the espionage stuff, like, it's kind of the most glamorous, but I feel like the political side of it is really the most fundamental.
But something I've been exploring recently, and I write about this in my own recent book, is how the Chinese Communist Party actively subverts all civil society. In fact, that's what distinguishes a totalitarian regime from a mere authoritarian regime. But I'd never really thought of it, that really this is, in a way, the function of the whole United Front, is basically to co-opt all civil society to be under the will of the party. Like, it's like the thing that, de Tocqueville basically imagined would make America unique and powerful, and the self-organizing ability of Americans, right? That's the civil society. So in communist China, all of that is co-opted under the Communist Party, but with this kind of veneer of civil societies. Like you've heard the term, there's NGOs and then there's gongos, the government NGOs, right? And so forth.
Well, I guess we should call them pongos in this case.
Yeah. Would you agree with that? That the United Front really is the method of co-opting or destroying civil society?
I think co-opting and subverting is destroying is the sort of last resort, mm-hmm. right? The effort is really to develop control.
But if you control it, it's not civil society anymore, clearly, right?
Well, but this is, we sit here and we wonder, like, what does the CCP mean when they say that they're a democratic party? Right? And what they mean is that the party represents everyone's interests. And what they're trying to do with United Front work, at least domestically, is to create a feedback loop so that sort of people feel like their feedback has gone in and that the party represents them, but then the United Front guidance comes back out and shifts the line and moves people around. I mean, they call this consultative democracy. And you can look at the State Council white paper if you want a good explanation, really, of the sort of the theory, if you will, of United Front work. But you can look at this internationally. And when you see Beijing talk about multipolarity, and they talk about a different kind of world order, a new type of international relations, what they're really talking about is applying that kind of consultative democracy, if you can even call it that, but really this effort of controlling and creating feedback loops that run through the party, but applying that onto an international scale. And it gets a little bit worse, in some perspective, because the way the party defines security, right? Most authoritarian regimes, and most democracies, will say resilience in the face of catastrophe, our sort of ability to manage threats, right? But the party defines it. It's in the national security law. They define it by the relative absence of threats to the party's ability to govern.
Peter, one quick sec. We're going to take a break, and folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with the president of the Jamestown Foundation, Peter Mattis. Let's talk about Canada. Something that was very stark. I mean, you had a whole press conference where Cheryl, you in Canada, to kind of introduce this report. It was received very well by some, very poorly by others. Canada seems disproportionately affected. I think that's actually clear in your report. Why?
Part of it, or the first reason I think that Canada is sort of more visible, is that they've faced less pushback over the last 2 or 3 decades, right? You have to go back to sort of the declassification of Project Sidewinder, which was a look at sort of the linkages between the CCP, business, triads, the potential for political influence being built in Canada. And it was a controversial report because some people claim that it wasn't particularly well done. Others will say, probably rightly, that it was a little too speculative, and that it hadn't quite reached what it was saying it was, but it was a sign of things to come. But that was kind of the last really public, visible pushback. And then you have the WTO ascension for the PRC.
Basically pushback on CCP influence operations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And putting it in the public eye and saying, wait a minute, this is something to think about. And as a result, a lot of these organizations were able to develop, were able to build, and they didn't really have to worry about being investigated. In part because the law enforcement intelligence resources in Canada are relatively small to be going after this. But they just didn't have it. Whereas if you think about the 1990s in the United States, you have the Clinton campaign finance scandal. You have people visiting the White House that were associated with state-owned enterprises and PLA-related corporations.
And pushback on that, right?
Congressional hearings, investigations, right? Money and attention being put to discuss these problems. You have the Cox Committee report that, some parts of it are kind of a little shaky and other parts of it are really, really good about sort of the threat of technological espionage and like all of the different ways in which the PRC will go after and target specific technologies and make sure that the expertise gets sort of funneled back to people who can use it, right? So we were discussing it. The FBI is bigger, and you have so many different investigations, right? You can kind of look back and be like, oh, well, there was a Wen-Ho Lee scandal, and obviously the FBI screwed things up, and here was an awful investigation where someone was unjustly sort of imprisoned. And leaving that case aside, right, you actually have a lot of other investigations where there were convictions or people were gently moved out of position, lost their clearances, were no longer at national labs. That was all taking place. So the PRC had a very good reason to take U.S. capabilities seriously. And as a result, I think that's why you end up kind of at a number of organizations per million people being quite a bit different in Canada versus in the United States, because they haven't had to deal with that kind of pushback. And we're only now getting to that point where you have a national commission investigating foreign influence in Canada, where you have the beginning of a kind of registration scheme that's still being put together. I think it's been about 1.5 years now that it's been going, but we're only at the beginning edge. And so that means that these groups have never really had to hide themselves. They've never really had to be careful, and therefore they could just sort of move and operate. And the fact is, it's always easier to operate in the open than it is to operate with camouflage and all of the things that you need to do for security if you're really concerned about being investigated.
It seems like these influence systems, the United Front work has, politically yielded a lot of success for the CCP in Canada. It basically, that what I'm trying to get at is because there's this heightened level of this activity, and this is represented in the number of organizations, but you can kind of, I guess you can measure it in other ways as well. This has had I think a pretty profound impact on Canada. I wanted, if you could kind of talk about that just a little bit.
I think the most important impact on Canada is that when this kind of approach dominates the discourse, right? As you know from your parent organization, the Chinese language news media has gone through a really profound change in the last 2 decades, right? So one of the impacts of this, and Canada certainly feels it, is that almost all Chinese language news media has gone toward the CCP, right? And
with a few exceptions.
With a few exceptions.
Yes.
Right? But it's, it's no longer, right, in sort of the good old days, if you will, or of sort of anti-communism within the Kuomintang in the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? There was an active sense of fighting back and of, fighting for control of the means of perception, fighting for control of newspapers and broadcast.
Peter, as we finish up, you're talking about at least being able to have a conversation about an institution or, a system that seeks to smash us, to use the term. Shouldn't we be doing more than just having a conversation?
Well, look, there are a number of things that need to be done, right? But as citizens, this is one of the most important things, is to be able to talk about it, because if we're associated with a university, if we're associated with a company, if we're with a nonprofit that's looking for partners, right? We have to be able to vet. We have to be able to look and to say, okay, here's what this is. Second thing that we have is that the scale of this problem is such that we can't arrest our way out of it, right? So that means that, yes, the citizen part of it is important. Second thing that it means is that we're going to have to use different kinds of tools than trying to drag everything into a courtroom. And besides, if we are dragging everything into a courtroom, that's maybe not an ideal approach for a democracy, right? We want our laws to sort of draw clear lines, and we want government investigative and intelligence powers to be on the illegal side. We don't want them investigating legal behavior. And that's the other reason why you have to have the citizen discussion and people taking responsibility for their own institutions and ensuring the integrity of them, right? And that also goes to governments, right? We lost the integrity of the World Health Organization when they failed to declare a pandemic, and they did it because of a CCP proxy inside the office that was preventing a decision to go. And what happened in the US is on us, but what happened in dozens of other countries around the world happened because their response was tied to the WHO's decision, right? Because they don't have the same resources to be watching around the world. So it was tied to it. That cost lives. So we have to remember those things. And it is a government responsibility because they are our voice in a place like the World Bank, in the United Nations, in the World Health Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization. You can go on and on and on, right? So it's not just, it's citizens should do this. Here's the government result. It has to be to protect and preserve the integrity of these institutions that have helped govern the way our countries have often interacted.
Well, Peter Mattis, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pretty good conversation. I think we kept it a little looser than we thought we would.
Thank you all for joining Peter Mattis and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.